Добър ден на всички, уважаеми дами и господа. Темата на
Good morning,
днешната
everyone.
дискусия,
Dear
разбира се,
ladies
е
and
част
gentlemen, the
от
topic
по-широката
of
тема
today's
за
discussion is
икономическата
part
сигурност
of
в
the
света
broader
след
theme of economic security in the world after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Sanctions serve a pivotal role in protecting Europe by constraining the Kremlin's capacity to wage war and to continue its aggressive pursuits. It is important, however, to recognize that sanctions alone cannot bring the war to an end. Bolstering Europe and its partners' resilience against corrosive capital inflows requires additional layer of measures, ones that fortify EU's economic and investment security. Presently, in the European Union and in Bulgaria, there are considerable gaps and discrepancies in enforcement capabilities and the effectiveness of investment screening mechanisms. Mechanism screening, along with other instruments such as sanctions enforcement, control of dual-use goods, monitoring of state aid and illicit financial flows, is now becoming an integral part of the EU and US economic security policy making. Bulgaria should seize the opportunity to align its legislation, also adopt international standards, and establish effective institutions for sanction enforcement and investment screening. Thereto related, Bulgaria needs to update its investment and national security strategies and laws. To achieve this, in the next 18 months, the government must involve the private sector and the civil society into the development of the screening mechanisms, naturally ensuring transparency throughout. Today, we are excited to continue these efforts with our long-standing partners from the Center for International Private Enterprise in Washington, D.C. My colleagues will be presenting the Center's baseline analysis and propose an integrated policy approach for enhancing Bulgaria's investment security. The private sector, including our partners from the American Chamber and the German Bulgarian Industry and Trade Chamber, will play an important role in this process. Let me finish by thanking all of you and thanking also the ambassador of the U.S. Embassy in Bulgaria, Mr. Kenneth Merton, before passing the floor on to him. The United States remains an indispensable partner for the EU in safeguarding our common economic and investment security and in building democratic resilience in the face of rising global authoritarian pressure. I hope our joint initiative will also lead to enhancing U.S. technology transfer investment in Bulgaria and the region to reduce the negative effects of sizable historical corrosive capital inflows.
Well,
Kenneth.
morning, and thank you very much, Dr. Shentov, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Center for the Study of Democracy and the Center for International Private Enterprise for hosting today's event here. Distinguished guests and fellow ambassadors and members of the diplomatic community, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to speak with you today on the important topic of investment screening. I arrived in Bulgaria exactly 2 months ago, 8 weeks, and during my brief time here, I've heard from many members of the business community about Bulgaria's great economic potential, and I think that is absolutely true. Bulgaria is rich not only in history, geography, and culture, but it also has educated, industrious, and a welcoming population. Even in my short time here, I've seen tremendous potential to increase foreign direct investment, especially in high-value sectors. So I hope that during my tenure here, I can help expand trade and investment ties between the U.S. and Bulgaria. Indeed, one of our embassy's top priorities is to increase bilateral trade and create more good jobs both in Bulgaria and in the United States. As we highlight in the U.S. Department of State's annual investment climate statement, Bulgaria is seen by investors as an appealing investment destination with government incentives for new investment and very attractive tax rates. We know that foreign direct investment brings significant benefits to Bulgaria, including economic growth, exchange of knowledge, and job creation. We are very supportive of efforts to increase foreign direct investment here. Despite its many benefits, we must also be cognizant of the fact that foreign investment is not always benign. We have seen examples, including from some of Bulgaria's neighbors, where foreign direct investment contributed to unsustainable debt burdens or provided foreign powers with decision-making authority over sensitive national sectors. In other cases, foreign investments introduced insecure communication technology that brought long-term cybersecurity risks. We know from multiple surveys that Bulgaria is one of the most vulnerable states in Europe to corrosive capital inflows. I'm encouraged that the Bulgarian government has created an investment screening working group and is moving forward with drafting investment screening legislation in line with the EU's regulation. A well-crafted foreign investment screening mechanism can achieve the twin aims of maintaining an open investment climate while also safeguarding national security. Creating a robust investment screening program will not only help protect Bulgaria's national security, but it will also improve the business climate here. As you know, investors seek markets with strong rule of law protection, predictable implementation of laws and regulations, and a level playing field for all participants. A transparent, predictable approach to screening foreign investments for national security risks will encourage more of the constructive foreign capital that Bulgaria needs while preventing the infusion of corrosive capital from malign or ill-intentioned foreign actors. I know that creating such a mechanism, a screening mechanism, is a complex and resource-intensive process. In the United States, our investment screening mechanism, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS for short, is an interagency process that involves 9 voting agencies. The CFIUS community, which is chaired by the Treasury Department, reviews certain foreign investments to determine whether they pose a risk to U.S. national security. When necessary, CFIUS prohibits investments or mitigates their risks by imposing conditions upon a deal. CFIUS can review any transaction that would give foreign investors ownership or control of an existing U.S. business, as well as transactions that would involve access to critical technologies, critical infrastructure, sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens, or real estate near sensitive U.S. government facilities. The CFIUS process is not the only example you can draw on as you craft your own mechanism. Over the past 3 years, 18 EU member states have adopted new investment screening legislation or significantly strengthened their existing legislation, including countries like Romania, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. I understand that the Bulgarian government is already working with other countries in the region to explore best practices from various screening mechanisms of its neighbors. I encourage you to build on this base of expertise within the EU, which I think will prove very valuable to you. An important consideration to keep in mind is that investment screening mechanisms, if wielded irresponsibly or unpredictably, have the potential to increase protectionism, harm existing foreign investors, and damage the investment climate. Investment screening measures should be transparent, predictable, accountable, and proportionate, as the OECD has outlined in its investment guidance. We've learned from others' examples that investment screening is most effective when it is a whole-of-government effort. To do this properly, almost every ministry in the government should have a voice in this process. Additionally, we know that stakeholder involvement in crafting the screening mechanism leads to better outcomes. I would encourage the Bulgarian government to meet early in the drafting process with the business community and with civil society to ensure broad buy-in on any investment screening legislation. We believe it is critical to get input from a diverse group of stakeholders from the domestic and foreign business communities, as well as from national security actors. This conference is an excellent first step, and I look forward to future events in which stakeholders can engage in conversations with policymakers as the screening legislation further takes form. In addition to investment screening, I would also encourage you to think about other steps Bulgarian government can take to protect your economic system from malign foreign actors. In particular, protecting your critical infrastructure systems, including your energy grid, defense systems, and information technology infrastructure is key. The weakening or infiltration of critical infrastructure systems could have grave economic and national security consequences. So we encourage you to use existing tools such as procurement laws to mitigate the security risks related to foreign interference in these sectors. The commitments Bulgaria made in the October 2020 Joint Declaration on 5G Security and the EU's 5G Toolbox are both useful starting points as you think through the tools you can employ in this effort. It's been our pleasure to collaborate with the government of Bulgaria as you work to strengthen your investment review practices. The U.S. will be glad to continue assisting you in any way that would be helpful, including by sharing with you our insights and lessons learned from our experience with CFIUS. As your partner and ally, it is in our mutual interest to cooperate to address national security risks related to foreign investments, particularly in light of the increased scope and scale of state-directed activities that could undermine our shared national security objectives. We look forward to continuing to work closely with the Bulgarian government and the business community here to support a strong business climate that attracts investors from around the world. So thank you for the opportunity to open this conference today. I look forward to a great discussion here. Thanks again.
Thank you, Ambassador Merton. John Key, Program Manager of the Center for Europe of the Center for National Private Enterprise, is going to moderate today's discussion. John.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shentov, and I thank the Ambassador for his thoughtful remarks. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Kay, and as already mentioned, I'm the Program Manager for Europe at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE as we call it. CIPE is a nonprofit affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we're also a core institute of the National Endowment for Democracy in the U.S. Through partnerships, grants, research, and other initiatives, CIPE works around the world to support democratic values through engagement of the private sector and economic policymakers. Open markets and democratic values are under existential threat because of global geoeconomic tensions and a range of economic coercion threats that all countries have to navigate. In response, many of the world's democracies have pursued enhanced efforts to adopt and strengthen their economic security toolkits. For example, Japan's 2022 Economic Security Promotion Act focused on securitizing supply chains for critical materials, promoting the development of advanced technologies, and ensuring a range of investment security in their critical infrastructure. A few weeks ago, many of you noticed that the G7 leaders announced the creation of a coordination platform on economic coercion. Here in the EU, as already has been mentioned, the EU Parliament is working towards establishing a countering economic coercion instrument and has established requirements for all member states to have investment screening regimes to protect their economic security, which is the topic that brings us together today. These different economic security tools are of paramount importance to protect democracies against corrosive capital and malign economic influence. Yet, like any economic policy, they must be well-informed, well-resourced, inclusively developed, and transparent. Tools like investment screening, if not properly implemented, pose risks to limit economic growth, overburden investors, and most concerningly, enable corruption. This is why we at CIPE have dedicated considerable resources and focus on supporting public-private dialogue around economic security. We believe that the best expertise must be given to government on this issue, and there needs to be robust engagement of both the private sector and civil society to make these policies accountable. That's why I'm really excited to be here today in Bulgaria, where there are significant opportunities to enhance economic security policy. I'm joined today with a wonderful panel of representatives from government, civil society, and the business community to discuss this issue. To introduce the panel briefly, we have Ruslan Stefanov, who's the Program Director and Chief Economist at the Center for Study of Democracy. We have Miglena Mileva, who's the Head of the Investment Policy Department at the Ministry of Innovation and Growth. We're also joined by Nikola Yankov, who's the Managing Partner at Expat Capital, Dr. Maya Naidinawa, who's the Vice President at the German-Bulgarian Industrial and Trade Chamber, Pavel Gorensky, who's the Director General of the National Customs Agency, and last but not least, Ivan Mikhailov, who's the CEO at AmCham Bulgaria. We're going to start out with introductory remarks from each speaker, and then we're going to have some time for a Q&A. To all the speakers, please try to limit your remarks to no more than 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll give you some reminders just so we have enough time for the Q&A. Without any further ado, I'd love to pass over to Ruslan to give a little overview of CSD's wonderful work in this space. Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. And I'll bore you with some slides, but I'll keep within 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll use the occasion to speak in English. So that, and also thanks to our wonderful interpreters in the background. When Russia was preparing its invasion in Ukraine in 2021, Europe suddenly realized that it had made a critical mistake in not taking economic security seriously when Gazprom lowered the amount of gas that it has across Europe in its storages to keep prices high. I think this was a rude wake-up call. I mean, Europe had already had a number of such wake-up calls in its dealing with China and technological security. And I was reading also this morning in the German press again of cases of Chinese scientific infiltration of high-tech pharmaceutical companies in Germany. And when CSD started its work on the Kremlin playbook, we were always getting this one and the same question: is it is it opportunistic what the Kremlin is doing, or is it strategic? And I'd say, of course, many times it's opportunistic, but we should bear in mind that it will be stupid if we do not take the precautions, the measures to monitor what's going on and to have specific actions for de-risking or decoupling, I should say, even in the case of Russia. And of course, this has a cost. And that's why we want to discuss this very carefully with the business community, with our international partners, because this means we're putting additional burden on businesses, but we want to keep our markets and our society safe. I will just very quickly go through some of the more interesting data that CSD has. Clearly, this is an overarching policy priority internationally, and in the EU. You know that this month the European Commission is going to come up with an economic security strategy for the EU, and I think this is going to be helpful also to Bulgaria. I'm not going to go through all the different details of how different countries put as what is important in investment screening and why they do it. This is just a selection. But of course, protecting critical infrastructure is one of the areas, and technological sovereignty. I would say also protecting yourself from illicit financial flows, and essentially being part of the highest tech community in the world is important also for Bulgaria. As you could see, there's been after 2020 actually, so before the invasion, there's been already quite an increase in the number of countries that have adopted some sort of an investment screening mechanism. Different countries in the EU, you probably saw, and we will be hearing also from our German counterparts what Germany was doing. As you might see, in not all the countries in the EU are already up to speed, and Bulgaria, Cyprus, Greece, Hungary as some of the countries that have less developed mechanism. I've put a smiley on the Bulgarian map because Bulgaria is already making headways. I'm happy that we're also joined by the former Minister of Innovation and Growth, Daniel Lorera, and also my colleagues at the Ministry of Innovation and Growth who are setting up this mechanism. But these are first steps that we need to very strongly develop. I'm not going to talk about the elephant in the room, about the huge investments that China has made and already made in the European financial and corporate networks, but I'm going to talk about the vulnerability that Bulgaria is facing and why what we see in terms of Chinese investments should worry us for the longer term because of the examples we had from the Kremlin and from Moscow. And this is essentially, I think, the bottom line for our new government to take note. I hope that today is going to be voted in, and I hope that they're going to take leadership on anti-corruption because we needed to ensure our economic security. I'm sure you're aware of CSD's wonderful work on the Kremlin playbook, which essentially shows how Russia has managed to weaponize economic instruments through state capture and strategic corruption. I think we need to be aware of that. Not all of it is, of course, that. We need to keep investments, we keep capital flowing in, but we don't have to be naive. We need to be aware that there are countries out there that have this corrosive investments as part of their military strategy. So we need to be very adamant about that. And CSD has put together, you could use the QR code. I don't know if it's going to be working from the screen, but you could certainly visit CSD's website, which look at the corporate footprint of Russia in Europe, and this is particularly on sanctions. And you see the red ones, this is where you have the most Russian companies under sanctions. That means these countries have to be particularly careful about what is happening in their economies. And these are things that have happened in the past 30 years, and that's why we need to be very, very careful for the long run. And this has had also an impact, and I'm not saying this is the only reason, but this has had an impact on investments. The last line you see is Bulgaria. Fortunately, this is the share of investments within GDP. We need to have this up. And this means Bulgaria's growth potential for the next 5 to 10 years has been diminished considerably in the past years. And we need to use the huge resources that we have from the EU to actually make more and more private investments come into the country. I'm finishing up with some ideas that CSD will be putting on, and we hope to work with our business partners from the US and Europe, and of course with our government partners, that we need to set the investment screening mechanism within a wider policy priority, and that needs to be on a positive investment promotion agenda. So getting more investments because Bulgaria needs them. But to get that, we need to be also aware of how we're going to safeguard ours and our partners' economic security. So like we were thinking of one way of putting this, and we were yesterday with my colleagues, and we were saying, well, countries that have good diversity policy and good data protection policies are probably the ones that we get the safest investments from. So we need to work on that level. And with that, I'd like to finalize by saying we have a wonderful baseline study that CSD's team put together on investment screening that we will be updated as the year goes. But I think that it will take some time, but I think it will be wonderful if in the next 2 to 3 years we could get a full, well-functioning, well-integrated mechanism for investment screening in Bulgaria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruslan, for that overview. One very quick deviation from the planned agenda. Ruslan informed me that Daniel Laura is here from Parliament, Bulgaria's former Minister of Innovation and Growth. Just like to invite that if you have any brief remarks before we continue with the panel, Ruslan and I would love to just hear your perspective on any of this.
Thank you, John. As a member of Parliament, I'm not sure I can do the brief part of it. 4 or 5 minutes, I'll stick to it. Your Excellencies, dear organizers, dear guests, thank you for taking the time to look at that important issue. We have been at the back burner of investment in our region. And the figures that Ruslan just showed are making this point pretty obvious. That was part of the reason why the previous regular administration did set up a special ministry to handle economic growth through private investment, spearheaded by innovation, of course, supported by a lot of European funds. But not only that, carrots are often insignificant, and who but Bulgaria knows what corrupt capital is actually able to achieve. For the better part of our 50-year socialist period, we were only being invested by politically minded capital, And through the 30 years of our conversion to a stable European democracy, we've seen a lot of attempts to actually create a hybrid environment here. Hopefully today we are at the very end of this period, and we are going to see significant inflows of technologically minded clean capital come into this country. And not necessarily only foreign capital, but also Bulgarian capital that has matured from resources, agriculture, and basic industry into more sophisticated technological reinvestments here. Now, in order to keep this under control, we'll need the help of best practices from anywhere we can get them. With my colleagues from the ministry, we've already started back in the day implementing some of the European guidelines on FDI screening. We certainly will continue to make efforts to do these a lot faster, particularly on inbound investment. Inbound investment screening can be a scary process for the investors. In my previous life, before politics, I was an investor in technological companies, and I was on the receiving end of the CFIUS process in the United States. So that can be scary to investors. But as you rightly mentioned, when applied correctly and swiftly, this can ensure a level playing field where all the participants are sure that they are investing in a market that's clearly regulated and actually aligned with both European and international standards of conduct. One of the particular schemes that we've ended were the golden passports, a previous scheme to stimulate investment that turned sour because it actually attracted corrupt capital into the country. So sadly, we had to sunset this bill. Nowadays, there are a lot of new investment opportunities in Bulgaria, particularly around telecommunications and infrastructure and energy. And we need to make triple sure that any investors that want to get in touch with Bulgarian infrastructure are aligned with our geopolitical interests. And clearly, the next government will have quite some work to do around that as well. I would make even the core point, actually, that even before investment screening, for any investor to consider Bulgaria and move us up those charts that you showed, we need to project a feeling of the rule of law being equally applied to any economic player in this country. That, sadly, has not been the fact according to most of the international ratings that you may have looked upon in the past decade. And it is urgently called upon the next administration of this country to start reversing aggressively this trend with any means possible, which is both within legislature and executive branch of the power, which is where I'm heading in a few minutes from now.
Thank you so much for coming and for sharing those remarks with us. I'd like to invite next Miklena Mileva from the Ministry of Innovation and Growth to give some remarks on the ministry's progress so far and considerable efforts.
May I see the presentation? Thank you. Presentation is bilingual, so you can see in both languages. First, I would like to thank all the speakers before because they have outlined very important topics and they show how important it is to make and to show that Bulgaria is a safe destination for investors, especially for investors in high-tech sector. Even in 2017, when Commission started the work on the regulation on FDI screening, it was clear that there are some threats to European economies and pattern of foreign direct investments were changing even in 2017. Many strategic assets were object of interest by state-owned enterprises in other countries out of European Union. And in increasing role of global economy, it was really important, and nowadays it's much more important to be sure that companies are participating in global value chains without risk to interrupt these chains. Foreign investors may seek to acquire control on European undertakings not only for other reasons, but for trying to acquire sensitive technologies. It's, as Minister Laurer outlined too, it's very important to show that Bulgaria is a safe destination for investors. As a result, was adopted regulation in 2019. This regulation outlines the framework for investment screening. There are two mechanisms under the investment screening regulation. One mechanism, which is the mechanism for cooperation. Bulgaria participates actively in this mechanism for almost 2 years. And mechanism for investment screening, which means that some of the investment have to be screened before investment is made. It's very important to make clear that finally states have a right to decide which sectors and which countries have to be screened, and if they have to be decided to have a threshold over this threshold to have screening. European Commission gives only consultative statements only if it's necessary. Sometimes in some countries, investors may feel that it's difficult to show your plans before investment is made, but experience in all these countries which have investment screening laws, some of these countries for decades, show that this is a well-established mechanism which doesn't endanger investments. Bulgaria, as a small country, has to analyze and to decide which countries, which sectors, and which is the minimum threshold for investment, which need to be monitored and screened. It's important to understand that our country is small, and for such small scale of economy, we don't have to make very difficult and very big mechanisms which put burden. For us, it's very important to attract investments, and our goal is to attract, not to reject investments. The only idea for this mechanism is to protect our national economy. We have started this process maybe about 2 years ago, with analyzing countries and sectors which can be monitored. For example, in Bulgaria, countries which are largest investors are usually Netherlands, Greece, Italy. It was in the beginning of 2033. Austria, Switzerland. Austria is actually usually one of the largest investors in Bulgaria. When we are deciding which countries have to be monitored, one of our goals is not to monitor investments from European Union, but also we have to be very careful when we decide which countries have to be monitored, because we don't have to discriminate against any country. As you may see, some of the countries in some periods of time have very large positive FDI inflows, and in some other periods they are negative inflows, like Netherlands. Such countries actually investments from these countries are very dependent on geopolitical developments. Concerning the sectors, actually one of the sectors which attract most investment is Bulgaria, is manufacturing and industry. Usually about 1/3 of FDI in Bulgaria is in this sector, although there are some fluctuations during the countries. And this sector is also very important for screening, and it's screened in many of the countries, but we are not talking about screening all of the investments. We have to be very careful which can be screened and it's not necessary to be screened. Financial sector in Bulgaria also attracts a large share of FDI, but it's really very well regulated sector, and it's not part of our scope here. Just to show illustration about the sectors for the last few years which have attracted investments. Historically, countries which have experience in FDI screening have different approach. Many of the countries have FDI screening for many years. Some of the countries have regulatory regimes which for years. Some of the countries created especially a legal framework for screening, like Germany, Austria, and Latvia, Lithuania. Some of the countries, sometimes in response of controversial foreign investment, some of the countries just expand the scope of regulatory regime.
Just
like,
giving a
yes,
1 minute
1 minute,
warning.
yes,
Thank
I'm
you.
finishing. And just to say a few words, what we are doing in Bulgaria, we have established working group. This working group started with analysis of the legal framework in Bulgaria. We have analyzed sectors which have protection of the sectoral legislation. After that, we have researched possible mechanism of other countries which can be used as example. I would like to stress that we are not trying to make a large mechanism like some large economies like Germany and France and other countries which have specially designated agencies. We are following models of countries with small-scale economies like Bulgarian, and we will try to work in close contact with all the stakeholders. After we are working now on bill legislation, and I have to say that we are definitely not trying to make unnecessary burden. It's very important for us to keep Bulgaria open for FDI. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate those remarks and applaud your efforts so far on this topic. I'd like to turn now to Nicola to give us a perspective from the private sector on this.
Thank you, John. I'd like to thank the Center for Study of Democracy for inviting me to speak in front of you today and share the financial sector's perspective. If I can see my presentation up on the screen, that will be helpful. So, in general, ladies and gentlemen, the private financial sector is a major facilitator of FDI. In fact, that's what we are designed or created to do. We like transactions, we like flows, we profit from them. And if you ask any major bank, be it a commercial bank or an investment bank, would they be happy to jump into a multi-billion-dollar transaction? They'll be saying, hell yeah. That's their first reaction. That's how they make money. That's how we make money. But at the same time, the private financial sector is inherently interested in checking the proliferation of corrosive capital, especially in their home jurisdictions, because that affects the country's standing, reputation, risk perception, investment rating, and ultimately creates problems with valuations and risk premiums and the ability to conduct business on an international scale. So those two factors are working against each other. One is the design of the banks to conduct business to facilitate capital flows, and the other is to check the proliferation of risk and the contagion that corrosive capital creates in the home basis of the banking community. So corrosive capital flows seldom make headline news. There's very few cases where you'd hear about this or that particular transaction. Usually acquisitions are made through obscure corporations, many of them locally owned, and change of control happens later in time, a few levels up the custody chain, often in offshore jurisdictions. But guess who learns about this change of ownership first? It's not the intelligence community, it's not the governments, it's the private financial sector. Because we are tasked by law, we are obligated by law to know our clients, to investigate the ultimate beneficial owners, and to keep up to date their profiles and we do learn first about any changes in control or in ownership. Now, capital flows obviously need to go through regulated private channels. That's what the modern financial infrastructure is. And corrosive capital is, by definition, I think, legal capital. So we're not talking about the criminal aspects here of money laundering. We are discussing those transactions that are on the face of it legal, but not really desirable, because they affect in a negative way the environment in a particular society or a country. So capital flows go through legitimate private channels, and at the same time, the private financial sector is very receptive to political messaging from the government. Banks are very protective of their reputation, both investment banks and commercial banks, because that's all they have ultimately. If they lose it, they cease to operate almost immediately. And corrosive capital principles have faced increasing difficulties in identifying willing private sector actors to move their money through recently. And that's a good thing, but not enough. As we've seen already by some of the speakers in the presentations, Europe has been heavily infiltrated or infested by bad state actors and their proxy capital principles. But unlike government agencies, strictly regulated private financial sector actors are less prone to corruption and harder to co-opt and into schemes designed to conduct the capital transactions of undesirable actors if they're informed and advised to do so. So obviously, without the means to reach the destination, foreign capital flows, including corrosive capital flows, cannot reach their destination and cannot achieve their objectives, which usually are taking control of strategic assets and therefore exercising political influence over the country that is targeted. So choking the legitimate private sector financial channels is paramount or key in stopping corrosive capital flows. And I would argue in front of you today that it is much faster, cheaper, easier, and more efficient to do so than create special legislation or special additional government agencies or resources to combat corrosive capital flows. Blocking the ability of bad actors to use private financial sector in democratic countries is, I think, primarily a matter of working closely with the private financial sector. The governments should simply create a high sensitivity to risk in the private financial sectors. I'm sure there's many people here in this room that have long and distinguished careers in the financial sector, so they know what I'm talking about. And if a bank is implicated in conducting corrosive capital, and that should be the political message that should be given out there all the time, it is going to be the beginning of the end for this bank as a going concern. So its shareholders would lose everything and its management would be branded for life. Without the means to conduct investments or without the facilitation of the private sector, no corrosive capital principles will be able to stay in the economy and undermine the targeted society. So a few words about government regulation of the financial sector actors. Obviously, the regulation of the financial sector is based on the concept of mitigating risks. So the basic justification and main objective of regulation is to mitigate the risk that financial institutions pose to the economy and society in general. Risk, of course, is a concept that comes in many forms: credit risk, systemic risk, operational risk. But over the past 20 years, since 2001, AML and CTF functions have been added increasingly to that portfolio in the risk management domain. However, a new and more important risk category has emerged, and this is the reputational risk for financial institutions. Regulators have not specifically coded that yet, or it has not been legislated to an extent that is written out in a law, but it is a major risk factor because, and the reputational risk obviously is the risk of a financial institution failing or degrading significantly due to the leak of damaging information in the public domain about it. And regulators are starting to pay more attention and to create, as a matter of a work in progress, oversight powers for themselves to manage, and to recommend to financial institutions measures that would mitigate reputational risks. And here we come to the issue of self-regulation of the financial sector. The primary objective of any financial institution is to stay in business. Okay, it's not about profit, it's about staying afloat for the benefit of its owners in the long term. So all commercial entities basically have the same objective, obviously, but banks are probably with a higher profile than most companies, and they're more prone to being affected by reputational matters or risks. If any action or transaction jeopardizes the objective of staying in business, then any bank management would veto any transaction because it's just not worth it. And corrosive capital flows are usually part of legally compliant transactions with a high economic benefit for the financial institutions, but they also should carry a very high reputational risk factor, which currently is not the case. And that's why I want to stress, this is the message that I want to give across, to send across this room today. Governments in general should be focused as a major objective in combating the proliferation of corrosive capital. The government's major objective should be to put the survival of the financial institutions that are involved into those transactions at risk. And if governments are able to do that, then that's the end of it. That's the end of a transaction, believe me.
Just 30 seconds or so, if it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the banks would generally be very sensitive to political messaging, and no one wants to be front page news with government agents taking documents out the front door, or although banks are very competitive, basically they're also very cooperative. So they tend to share information amongst each other because there's something called contagion in the banking sector. So if one gets hit or fails, the rest may be adversely affected. So if there are designation lists or any additional measures taken by governments that are given to banks, formally or informally, I would argue that that would be sufficient for them to stop conducting business and to, they'll be blacklisting clients, not because the law says so, not because it is, required on a formal basis, but because they would risk everything if they conduct business in a way that is politically unacceptable. However, that should be strongly reinforced, messaged constantly. There should be a task force in the government agencies, usually within the framework of the AML, CFT task forces, that should be curating those matters, enforcing those lists, and communicating on a regular basis with the management of top institutions in the economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insightful remarks on the private sector's role and how self-regulation can be a real asset in this larger debate. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Maya Nidinawa from the German-Bulgarian Industrial and Trade Chamber. Thank you so much.
If you allow, I will speak in Bulgarian. And I would like to have this presentation.
Could we pass the remote?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan.
My name is Maja Najdenova, and I'm in my position as Vice President of the German-Bulgarian Industry and Chamber of Commerce. Why I am here? Извинявам се, исках да говоря на български.
But I continued in English. So why am I here? 1 year ago, my colleagues from the American Chamber of Commerce invited us to cooperate with them in relation to all their projects on the topic of the rule of law. But along with this request for cooperation, we also organized several events, and having in mind that the backdrop of what's going on in Bulgaria, would like to continue our partnership not only with the American Chamber but also with other chambers and other partners. We would like to be there to support everyone and all of our members with our know-how and our knowledge and experience to come forward with certain proposals and also to participate in the legislative amendments discussions. And there are two related. I was invited at this format as well to present some information as to what's going on in other countries. For example, in Germany, what changes of the legislations they have implemented in connection to the FDI screening. So I had a conversation with my colleagues from the Center for Study of Democracy, and they were very interested in my doctoral thesis some 20 years ago and what I wrote back then about FDI in Bulgaria. Back then, the regulatory regime from German perspective was awkward. It was quite restrictive compared to the German one. It was difficult to buy land in Bulgaria. There are certain restrictions that are even today applicable in the insurance sector, banking sector, and others. Today I read the Bulgarian foreign investment law. Now, the most recent amendments were introduced back in 2015, and there are no more recent ones, but apparently today's political situation very urgently requires that we overturn the trend. I will give you an example from Hamburg, because I'm coming straight from Hamburg. So what happened following the amendments of the German FDI law? It was updated in 2020 and 2021, and I will tell you what is happening now with the FDI control in Germany, specifically speaking about investment flows coming from outside the European economic community. Well, in Bulgaria, we read that the port of Hamburg is refusing to be purchased by Chinese investors. The articles also mentioned that there are some investors interested into buying Bulgarian ports. So this was the comparison made in media. So what happened? In October 2022, the federal cabinet, that is actually the body responsible on refusing investments, took a decision for partial restriction or partial ban to purchase all the assets of the Hamburg port. And thereto resulting, the COSCO, the Chinese investor, could only acquire 25% of the Hamburg port. So following these special purpose instruction. So there was a question I was asked: how is the German economy dealing with these situations? On the one hand, we want to see foreign investments inbound in Germany, but naturally public interest should also be considered. There was a broad discussion in German media why inbound investment should be restricted, banned, or why they should not be. And the broader society was involved. However, it was not well explained that actually the German legal tools only restricted Chinese involvement and investment, and did not ban Chinese investment altogether. It only restricted up to 25%, but there were also instructions on investments, intentions by Costco to not move and acquire additional shares. This was done by the Ministry of Economy of Germany. This deterred to a certain extent strategic investments in the Hamburg port. This was purely financial investment. So this is how certain balance was achieved. Maybe you don't know, but Hamburg has very close cooperation with Chinese. We have a German-Chinese arbitration court in Hamburg, and this comes to exemplify how old, traditionally and historically long relations with Chinese Hamburg has. So the tools under the German legislation allowed for a maximum restriction of the possible acquisition, and this is how public interest was protected. Maybe there are certain other examples from recent periods that we can look at and see how many cases there are currently in procedure within the mechanism for FDI control. I will not read them out, but this is data from the German Ministry of Economy. But what I can nevertheless say that instructions as to what investments in what sectors should be controlled, and information on this is distributed to all investors that may have the desire to acquire in German enterprises. They have to be registered duly. So these investments are continuously growing. For example, if investors would like to participate in media companies that may have influence on public opinion in Germany, are one such subsector, or artificial intelligence companies are one other subgroup. Also, at the backdrop of COVID-19 pandemic, all companies that manufacture personal protective equipment are also within the focus of these control mechanisms, and the list is continuously getting longer. And I have taken some statistics for you to see how many cases are being processed in Germany and are in the mechanism. Additionally, there are specific rules for the dual-use military sector, but the German law also has retrospective application, which means that even if the transaction has been concluded, reviews and checks can be done retrospectively if the investor has acquired 25%. And also, most importantly, sanctions can be imposed up to 5 years of imprisonment and a fine up to 500,000 euros in case a company is obliged to be registered under the investment mechanism but has not. So the example I gave you is one good example, but naturally with my colleagues from the chamber we are available to come forward with other examples that you can easily borrow from, so that you can prepare the draft of the mechanism at the Ministry of Innovation and Growth. Thank you.
Dr. Najdenova. I'd like to turn now to Pavel Gorensky from the National Customs Agency. Pavel, we're really looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, John, for giving me the floor. Your Excellencies, dear Dr. Shentov, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Before starting, I would like to say that I'm honored to be here and be given the opportunity to address such a major challenge as corrosive capital and investment screening is. Of course, from a customs point of view. And I would like to say that I accept this opportunity as a recognition for the efforts of the National Customs Agency of Bulgaria. And at that point, with your permission, I will switch to Bulgarian in order to keep to the time limits. Първо, митническата гледна точка. Да, широко позната в обществото митническата администрация като приходна агенция. Да, тя е една от двете приходни администрации на страната с принос за миналата година от 43% в националния бюджет. Но разбира се, другата половина от задълженията и ангажиментите на агенция Митници са свързани с съвместно, разбира се, с всички правоприлагащи структури на територията на страната, с подсигуряване безопасността и сигурността на гражданите и обезпечаване в различни аспекти, много наброй на националната сигурност на страната. И тъй като времето е кратко, бих искал да се съсредоточа само върху един отделен аспект, който дава проявлението на днешната тема в митническата дейност. Най-явната и пряка допирна точка е борбата с прането на пари чрез контрол върху преноса на валута, така както е регламентиран във Валутния закон в националното законодателство и регламент 1672 на Комисията за контрол на паричните средства, които се внасят в Съюза или се изнасят, и също регламент 776 от 2021 година на Комисията. Тук бих искал да кажа, че тенденцията, която наблюдаваме последните 5 години, е за бурен ръст на незаконния трафик на парични средства през българските граници. За миналата година са задържани 43 милиона лева в равностойност, различни видове валути, което е 2 пъти повече от резултата на по-предишната година, а тенденцията към настоящата година е да се удвои резултата от 2022 година, имайки предвид, че само за първите 5 месеца вече имаме над 30 милиона лева средства задържани при опит за незаконен трафик през границата. Новите моменти в европейското предизвикателство наложиха да се подготвят промени в националното такова, и тук искам да благодаря на екипа на агенцията, който много бързо подготви целият пакет промени за изменение и допълнение на Валутния закон. Премина общественото обсъждане и предстои внасяне в Министерски съвет и в последствие в Народното събрание за гласуване. Бих искал да отбележа, че проектът изцяло въвежда всички нови моменти, заложени в европейското законодателство, и отразява констатираните слабости от оценителния екип в рамките на процедурата за оценка на България по 5-ти оценителен кръг на Комитета на експертите за оценка на мерките срещу изпирането на пари, Манивал, и публикувания в финалния доклад на България специалната група за финансови действия, които касаят контрола върху паричните средства, които се пренасят през границата на страната. Ясно е на всички ни, че България се нуждае от приемане на законопроекта в спешен порядък, тъй като проблемът е изключително сериозен. И предвид факта, че системата за контрол на паричните средства, които се внасят в Съюза или се изнасят, допълва правната уредба за предотвратяване на изпирането на пари и финансирането на тероризма също, разбира се, както е установена в Директива 849, едно от най-важните правомощия, които се въвеждат с регламент 1672, е временното задържане на паричните средства при една от следните хипотези. Деклариране, когато не е изпълнено, това са най-често срещаните случаи при задържането, и естествено втората хипотеза, която е още по-важна, установяване наличието на признаци, че паричните средства, независимо от тяхната стойност, са свързани с престъпна дейност, и разбира се целият комплекс от мерки и действия по установяване произхода на парите. И тук като заключение бих искал да подчертая, че за да бъде дейността на държавата всяка от държавните структури успешна,
in order for the different agencies to implement their obligations successfully, we need to implement a large-scale approach to combat the traffic of illicit funds. These are just one indicator behind which there are enormous criminal activities in the form of drug trafficking, trafficking in arms, in dual-use goods, and all other sorts of criminal activities. So it is of key importance to have the Bulgarian legislation be amended as soon as possible so that we can counter these negative processes more successfully. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to turn now to our final panelist, Ivan from AmCham, Bulgaria.
Thank you, John. I will finish the line of the Bulgarian speakers. So, Ваши превъзходителство, доктор Шентов,
Your Excellencies, Dr. Shentov, dear colleagues. Now, being the last panelist, I will probably have to summarize what was said already, but there are several things I would like to mark out in this outline, in this direction. Now, it's really wonderful that today we have the opportunity to hear about the efforts of the Ministry of Innovation and Growth, because probably most of you remember that, as Dr. Naidenova said, the 30th of November last year, here we spoke about rule of law, messages to business, and what has to happen with Bulgaria's image in front of foreign investors. Because today, more than any other day, the colleagues from the American chamber and colleagues from other chambers, we have to work with economic diplomacy in order to attract investors. So we have several causes. We need to send out several messages if we want to really successfully fight this negative image of Bulgaria connected to being a destination of corrosive capital. They're two related. We met on several occasions with the colleagues from the Center for Study of Democracy. We meet most often with them, but we also meet with other colleagues from other chambers, and we've discussed several aspects. Naturally, we really want to attract investors. We much need these investors. We have certain geopolitical given circumstances, and unfortunately we are lagging behind our neighboring countries, and naturally this delay can be explained. So, on the one hand, our efforts continue, and we need to ask a question that was asked by a colleague from the Ministry of Innovation and Growth. The question is, what type and which investors do we want to really attract to Bulgaria? On the other hand, we have to consider the specifics of national security for certain sectors among those, because there is this delicate topic that has to be taken into account, and challenges do exist in this respect. So I think that in the format of public-private partnership, our role as being chambers of commerce and industry is to more than ever organize a good dialogue, efficient dialogue, in order to implement a good legislative framework, one that is aligned with the European rules, in order not to burden excessively or unnecessarily the business in Bulgaria. Now, we do acknowledge that the business climate is improving, but nevertheless we need to work to avoid unnecessary burden. At the same time, we need to be very careful so that our framework is not deterring well-intended investors. Even if we have a good law, if it's not implemented correctly and efficiently, a law or a legislative framework, we might have and end up with some negative outcomes. As a general rule, the American chamber, probably in other chambers as well. When we make analysis and study investors and the investment inflows, we go back in time. We are very 360 oriented. Ownership is difficult to explore. It's difficult to know what the end beneficiary can be or who the end beneficiary is. And sometimes a good-looking investment can end up being suspicious after due analysis. And if such analysis is not correctly implemented, we might end up with unwanted results. But having heard from the Ministry of Innovation and Growth, I can conclude that the efforts of the state are present, but this, along with our efforts at the chamber, also the efforts with Cyprus, our partner, is a very good thing. I hope that this time Bulgaria will be able to borrow from best practices, and we will end up with a very good working mechanism that would help out to have a transparent, clean, and efficient framework, one that Bulgaria much needs.
Thank you so much, Ivan, and indeed to all the speakers who came before. We're running a little bit short on time, but I want to make sure we have a chance for discussion and input from audience members. So at this stage, I can open it up. If you can raise your hand, I can call on different folks that might have something else to add, and you can provide any statements that anyone else has, questions, and as you kind of saw from the speakers, please feel free to speak in Bulgarian or English in your remarks. So I'll look now if anyone has any initial inputs or thoughts. Wonderful.
Владислав Кръстев, Център за изследване на демокрацията. Съм тук като представляващ Софийски университет. Искам да попитам представителите на държавната
I have a question of the representative of the government. Do we have a definition in place to distinguish between corrosive capital and illicit funds or illicitly acquired revenues? I don't know, probably you're addressing your question to me. In fact, with corrosive capital, the focus is much larger. And when we screen investments, we use the definition laid down in the regulation itself with the clarification that each country has the right to add to this definition. But all in all, we are using the definition from the regulation when we perform our screening activities.
Thank you so much. Do I see anyone else? I know, Vanya, I know you had a couple of remarks you wanted to make on the illicit finance side. Maybe if you'd be willing to chime in now.
Thank you, John. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here today and seeing so many friends and familiar faces. Thank you all for being here today and contributing to such an invigorating discussion on a very meaningful topic. So here are my 2 cents for today. I just wanted to highlight the crucial importance of illicit finance. Estimated at around $1.6 trillion a year, illicit cross-border financial flows are harming economic development on a national and global scale. In the last one and a half year, we at CSD have embarked on a very arduous and challenging journey, and we've been trying to study and research illicit finance, their main components, sources, and channels. And actually what we have found is very alarming and very dangerous. We have seen that illicit financial flows in our region, in Southeast Europe, particularly in Bulgaria, the Western Balkan 6, and Croatia too, are manifold. They're multi-directional, and they're proportionally large as a percentage of the national and regional GDPs. And if you look at it, the global estimates of IFFs are around 3%, and we have estimated that in our region they're double, and in some cases they're even more than double. I would say the common denominator of the Southeastern European countries is their vulnerabilities, which are kindled by strategic corruption, and state capture. And illicit capital on a staggering scale is flowing in and out of the region. And if you're particularly interested in our study on illicit finance, I urge you to look at our report. Ruslan shared in one of the slides, the one slide with there was a QR code. So if you use that QR code, or if you just look at our website, the Kremlin playbook.csd.bg, you will see our research there, our method flows, outflows, and check that with more detail. I think what is worth noting here is that although we have been able, or we have been trying to estimate illicit financial flows, we are not always certain of the origin of where these funds are actually coming from. You know, in some cases, we can very visibly say, okay, these are Russian illicit funds or Chinese illicit funds, but this is not always the case. And this is why adopting and implementing an effective, or as Ambassador Martin said, predictable and transparent investment screening mechanisms is critical. This is imperative for stemming the flow of corrosive capital in our region and creating a conducive environment for constructive capital and for foreign direct investments flowing to our region. So basically, these are my 2 cents. Whoever is more interested, please check our work on illicit finance. Thanks, John.
Thanks so much, Vanya. And just to plug, definitely, the CSD website, you can find the illicit finance report. Also out front and on the website, you can find another wonderful report that was launched this past December, which goes into detail on the current state of Bulgaria's progress towards investment screening mechanisms, also goes into structures of how Bulgaria can take next steps on that process. And I think you'll find it's a digestible and really robust report that can give you really great insight on it. And obviously all the other presentations and whatnot are available on CSD's website. And if you have any trouble with that, you can talk to one of the number of CSD attendants here. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more remarks. Is there any other speakers who'd like to come forward? Well, in that case, I think we're fine to close a little bit early, a little on time. And I'd just like to extend another thank you to everyone for having such a robust attendance here today. I'd like to thank again all the speakers for their remarks. Mr. Ambassador and Dr. Shantov, thank you again so much for opening us up. And I think hopefully this is a start and to a continuing debate and vigorous public-private dialogue around this topic. And thanks again so much, and please mingle and chat a little bit afterwards, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.